Salvete, omnes. Today we are going to talk about uses of the accusative. This is part 2 to a two-part video series. So we're going to be covering the slightly harder uses of the accusative. So the accusatives that you'll probably encounter a bit later on in your Latin journey. So these are what we'll go over today are the double accusative with verbs of asking, telling, and concealing, the accusative denoting motion towards, the accusative of extent or duration, and then some poetic uses of the accusative, which has sort of evolved from Greek influence and is only found in authors like Virgil and Horace and Ovid. So, first one we've got is the double accusative. So verbs of speaking, naming, appointing, or concealing can all take two accusatives. These verbs will take a direct object, so that's one of the uses of the accusative that we discussed in the first part, in the first video, and a predicate accusative. So the role of the predicate accusative is to complete the meaning of the verb, right? So we've got two example sentences. We've got popules Cicoronem consulem criaverunt. So the people of Rome appointed Cicero consul. So here we can see that consul is sort of completing the meaning of the verb in the sense that you can just say that the people appointed Cicero. You can definitely say that. But in order to get the full meaning of the verb, you will want to know what they appointed him to. So the verb will take a direct object, and that will tell us who has been appointed, right? Who is the receiver of the action. And then we'll also get a predicate accusative telling us what they were elected to. So it's similar in the second example, which is Mater liberos multus res rogabat. So the mother was asking her children many things about many things or many questions. So here, obviously, we've got the rogabat, right? So the asking, and then we've got a direct object, which is the children, and they're the people asking, being asked the questions. And then we've got the predicate accusative, multos res, which is just giving us more information about the verb, right? Asking about what? It's the same as, they elected him to what position? So it's the same with naming and concealing. So they named the child Hercules, right? So the child is the direct object and Hercules is the predicate accusative because it's completing, they named him Hercules, right? It's giving us more information about the naming, about the verb. So usually with double accusatives, right, it can be a little bit confronting because we're only used to seeing one accusative in a sentence, or an adjective and a noun, both being in the accusative. But the important thing to remember with double accusatives is that usually, this definitely isn't always the case, but it's a good rule of thumb, is that the direct object will usually be a person, and the predicate accusative will usually not be a person. It's usually an inanimate object or a thing, and it usually has to do with the meaning and completing the meaning of the verb. So if you see two accusatives and one of them is a person, and it makes sense as the direct object, then it's pretty okay to assume that the other accusative is going to be the predicate accusative. Okay, so let's go on to the locative accusative, or the accusative denoting motion towards. So most of the time when indicating motion towards a place, the accusative takes a preposition. However, there are certain words in Latin that don't need a preposition and instead simply go into the accusative case. So if you've studied Latin before, you might have heard of the locative case. And generally, what the locative case gets split up into is the accusative, which is showing motion towards something, and the ablative case, which is showing motion away from something. So we've got actually a list of words that don't take prepositions and just go into the accusative to show motion towards. But here are just some examples. So rus imus, we are going to the countryside. We don't need to say ad rus imus, we can just say rus. And then fures romam effugient, the thieves will flee to Rome. So this is a good one to show the difference between whether romam is in the accusative or the ablative, because if it was in the ablative, it would be the thieves will flee away from Rome. But because romam is in the accusative case, we know that the thieves are actually going to flee to Rome. So this is also a fun little tidbit. In Monty Python's Life of Brian, the protagonist tries to say Romans go home, and then a Roman guard finds him, and instead he's just so appalled by the grammar. Romanes is wrong, it's actually Romani. And then eunt is not in the imperative mood, which you can go see my verbs video if you want to know what that means. And then finally, we've got domus instead of domum in the accusative case, right? Because we want motion towards. When he wants the Romans to go to their homes, right? So you can actually say that, see here with the domum, that the Roman guard makes him change it to the accusative case in order to indicate motion towards, and then write it out 100 times. It's a very funny scene. Okay, so here are all, this isn't an extensive list, but these are probably the ones that you're going to see most often. We've got rus, ruris, countryside, domus, domi, which we saw with the previous example, Romans go home. And then we've got bellum, belli, which bellum usually means war, but in this case, it's probably, the soldiers were marching to battle. If you were going to say that, you don't need the ad. You just say Romans marching bellum to battle. And then we've got homus, homi, ground, and then also the names of towns. So Rome, Baiae, Pompeii, other towns don't need the ad, they just go into the accusative, and small islands. Okay, now we can move on to the 7th use of the accusative case, the accusative of extent or duration. So the accusative is also used to indicate the extent of space. So an example of that would be how long a given road is or how high something is. And then also it's used to express the duration of time. So an example of that would be how many days it took to travel somewhere, how long someone stayed somewhere. All of that goes into the accusative case. So if in Latin you wanted to say the boy was 3 feet tall, you would say puer tres pedes est. And that would be the accusative of extent, right? Because you're showing the extent of his height. And then if we wanted to say in Latin Troy was sieged for 10 years, we would say Troia decem annos obsidiebantur. So again, decem annos goes into the accusative case. We're probably going to translate it into English with a 4. And that would be the accusative of duration of time. So time or any sort of extent of spatial things always goes into the accusative in Latin. Okay, the final use of the accusative, which is actually 3 uses that have been snuck into 1 use. But if you're not studying poetry, if you're not studying Virgil or Horace or Ovid or another famous Catullus, other famous Roman poets, you don't need to worry about this, because this does not appear in classical prose. It's only something that the poets do, which has been influenced by the Greek use of the accusative, because obviously the Roman poets want to look all fancy and Greek, etc., etc. So, but if you are studying poetry, it's important to know these 3 rogue uses of the accusative that pop up in poetry that don't pop up in classical prose. So the first one is the accusative with adjectives. So you can have an adjective plus the accusative, and that will mean the adjective with respect to the accusative. So an example would be flower comus. So flower means fair, right? So you'll note that they're not agreeing, right? The adjective is not agreeing with the accusative, but then the object that the adjective is describing goes into the accusative, comas, which is hair. So that means that she was fair with respect to her hair. Which you could just translate as having fair hair. She had fair hair. Okay, the second poetic use of the accusative is with verbs. So the accusative tells us which body part is affected by the verb. So we've got fime tragula ictis. So fime, by, goes into the accusative, and then tragula goes into the ablative. That's actually the ablative of means, but we don't need to get ahead of ourselves. And then we've got ictus, so struck in the thigh by a javelin. Yeah, so in English, we would usually translate this with the preposition in, right? Because we want to show sort of relativity when we're talking about body parts. You know, he had, I don't know, he was struck on the head. We wouldn't just say he struck head. We would say he was struck on the head. So again, this could also be translated like with respect to, right? He was struck by a javelin with respect to his thigh, if that makes any sense. Okay, and then the final poetic use is with passive participles. So when verbs are describing a person putting on clothing, the clothing goes into the accusative. So indutus pallum means clothed, right? So that's a perfect passive participle, clothed with a robe. So again, in English, we're not going to translate this as a direct object, like clothed robe. The robe was clothed. But again, as with all of these, you could sort of, if you wanted to, in a really clunky way, think of it as the accusative of respect. So the accusative, so he was clothed with respect to a robe, which in English we just translate that with, right? He got dressed into a robe. There's lots of ways to translate it in English that make a lot more sense, but just be aware that if Latin is going to use a passive participle in poetry and they're talking about clothing, the clothing is going to go into the accusative case. That's how specific we're getting. But with that, iter perfecimus sic bene valetur. That is all, what was it, 8? Yes, 8. All 8 uses of the accusative case. So when you see an accusative in Latin, you know that it must be one of those 8 usages, which is a lot to keep in mind. But just wait until we get to the genitive and the ablative, where there's more like we hit the double digits of ways that that case can be used. But that's it for the ablative. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below, and have a great day. Wale.